West African country's military junta has tightened their grip on foreign companies that are mining gold.
Mali's gold once collapsed economies, crowned the richest man in history, and made empires kneel. Today, that same gold is under lock, and the key is in the hands of a soldier, not a king. Why is Colonel Assimi Goïta suddenly guarding the legacy of Mansa Musa like it's a weapon? Let's find out. When Mansa Musa returned from Mecca in 1325, Mali was more than an empire. It was a statement. A statement that an African kingdom could command the world's attention, wealth, and respect without asking for permission. But what followed wasn't a golden age. It was a slow, calculated erasure. After Musa's death, Mali didn't collapse overnight. It was chipped away, one betrayal at a time. First came internal strife, then foreign incursions. Then the Atlantic trade routes diverted wealth away from the Sahara. But it wasn't just gold that vanished. It was the knowledge of ownership, the memory that this land once held the beating heart of the global economy. By the 19th century, when French colonial boots landed in Mali, they weren't discovering gold. They were reclaiming maps drawn centuries ago by kings they envied. The colonizers didn't just take Mali's resources. They took control of its narrative. In textbooks, Musa became a footnote. In contracts, Malians became labor. In borders, the empire became a broken line on someone else's paper. Gold was extracted not by merchants, but by military-backed companies. Villages near mines were turned into security zones. The profits were routed to Paris, while the pollution stayed in Bamako's rivers. It wasn't just theft, it was refined plunder, legitimized by international law and sanitized through development rhetoric. And the worst part? They made Malians forget it was ever theirs. The people were told that mining gold was too technical, that refining it required foreign technology, and that selling it on the market required Western banks. So Mali dug, while someone else counted. By the time the 21st century arrived, over 80% of Mali's gold mines were owned by foreign companies, with multi-decade contracts signed under pressure, corruption, or desperation. The wealth beneath the ground, once used to build Timbuktu's libraries, was now filling vaults in Toronto, Sydney, and Paris. But something was always off, because Mali never stopped shimmering beneath the surface. That shimmer? It wasn't just mineral. It was a memory. A memory of a time when Malians didn't need permission to be powerful. And it's this memory that Goïta's rise has reawakened. Not through nostalgia, but through action. The moment Mali's transitional government began challenging those mining contracts, the West didn't just panic about economics. They panicked about control. Because the gold wasn't just valuable, it was symbolic. And whoever owns it doesn't just own the metal, they own the story. Which leads us to one unsettling question. Why is Assimi Goïta treating this gold like a war zone? Because it is one. To most of the world, gold is just a commodity. But in Mali, it's a front line. A silent battlefield where every ounce carries a flag, either foreign or sovereign. Colonel Assimi Goïta isn't simply guarding gold. He's defending Mali's right to define itself. And that makes the mines more volatile than the Sahel's desert winds. Goïta understands something the West underestimated. Gold is political. It funds governments, strengthens currencies, and buys silence. For decades, Mali's gold was weaponized against it, used to prop up foreign economies while Mali remained locked in developing status. Every ton of gold that was left without reinvestment was an economic wound. Every royalty capped at 6% was a mockery of sovereignty. When Goïta seized power in 2021, many in the West dismissed him as another power-hungry soldier. But that was a mistake. Because while they watched his military moves, they missed his economic blueprint. His real battlefield wasn't just political, it was financial. And at the center of it all stood gold. Within months, Goïta's government began auditing mining contracts signed under previous administrations. Many of these deals, now under investigation, were made during periods of intense IMF debt dependency or foreign diplomatic pressure. Some lacked transparency altogether. Others were brokered through shell companies tied to former French officials. Instead of chasing aid, Goïta turned inward. His administration pushed legislation requiring majority Malian ownership in future mining ventures. He demanded in-country refining, threatening to revoke licenses from firms that refused. And perhaps most provocatively, he backed local geological surveys to reduce reliance on foreign assessments, essentially questioning the very data that justifies foreign profits. This shift sent a chill through global investors. Mali was no longer an open vault. It had become a sovereign gatekeeper, a protector of wealth with a historical consciousness. And Goïta wasn't alone. He forged deeper ties with neighboring Sahel states, Niger, Burkina Faso, leaders equally tired of the extractive economic model. Together they discussed forming a regional resource bloc, leveraging their gold, uranium, and rare earths not as export items but as bargaining chips. These moves didn't go unnoticed. Western diplomats issued quiet warnings. Ratings agencies threatened downgrades. Think tanks accused Goïta of economic nationalism. But on Malian soil, something else was happening: confidence. Villages near mines began seeing infrastructure. Local workers received training. State television showed gold being melted, not in Canada, but in Mali. To Goïta, this wasn't just about minerals. It was about reversing an engineered dependency. If Mali couldn't own its gold, could it truly call itself free? But with foreign interests rattled and regional momentum building, a new question rises. Why is France, the old colonial master, suddenly so desperate to keep its boots near Mali's goldfields? Because for France, Mali isn't just an old colony, it's an economic artery. And that artery pumps gold, influence, and access straight into the heart of Europe's dwindling power. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Behind the polished language of diplomacy, France's involvement in Mali has always had an ulterior motive. While the headlines spoke of counterinsurgents, the boots on the ground often encircled resource-rich zones. Many of France's key military installations in Mali were strategically placed near mining corridors, not conflict zones. The map says security, but the terrain says extraction. This is where France's obsession with Mali's gold becomes clear. In recent years, as France's economic growth stagnated and its influence in West Africa slipped, its reliance on African raw materials, especially gold, quietly deepened. While Mali exported over 70 tons of gold annually, very little of that was refined, taxed, or transformed locally. Instead, the gold was flown to refineries in Switzerland and exported under French-controlled contracts, often priced far below market value. These underpriced contracts weren't just about profit, they were about currency stability. France's post-colonial CFA franc system, which still ties 14 West and Central African nations to the euro, relies heavily on capital reserves, much of which is guaranteed through extractive flows like gold. A disruption in that flow doesn't just hurt Mali, it rattles the entire French-African monetary structure. So when Goïta began demanding more control, Paris didn't just lose a client. It risked losing a pillar of its global standing. That's why France reacted like it did, not with negotiation, but with covert pressure and public outrage. It started with diplomatic rebukes and escalated to a full-blown propaganda war. French media outlets began portraying Goïta as unstable, authoritarian, and reckless. Mali was painted as a nation spiraling into chaos, despite growing regional support for its new economic path. France also attempted to use international institutions as leverage. It lobbied the ECOWAS bloc to isolate Mali, called on the EU to freeze financial transfers, and pressured the UN to maintain a strong presence under humanitarian pretexts. But each move revealed the same desperation. Paris was no longer in control. Then came the symbolic blow. Mali expelled the French ambassador and shut down French broadcasting in the country. For the first time in decades, the French political machine was operating blind inside one of its former African strongholds. But Goïta didn't stop there. He turned to new allies, countries outside the colonial sphere, and began reshaping Mali's security partnerships. The West framed this as a pivot to authoritarianism. But Malians saw something else: independence. Now France faces an uncomfortable truth. If it can't control Mali, it risks losing the rest of Francophone Africa too. Which brings us to a larger shift on the horizon. Is Mali's gold triggering an African rebellion bigger than one country? Yes, and the tremors are shaking the old order at its core. Mali's fight for control over its gold is no longer an isolated struggle. It has ignited something far deeper, a regional awakening. For decades, African nations were taught that the wealth beneath their feet was too complex to manage, too unstable to protect, and too global to truly own. But when Mali challenged that idea and survived, it proved something radical. The empire can be defied. Soon after Mali tore up mining contracts and expelled French forces, Burkina Faso and Niger followed with similar moves, forming an unexpected alliance with Goïta's government. What began as national policy quickly morphed into a coordinated rebellion. The three nations now operate under a new security and political bloc, the Alliance of Sahel States, AE, which isn't just about defending borders. It's about defending resources. All three members of AES are mineral-rich. Niger holds some of the most strategic uranium deposits in the world. Burkina Faso is emerging as a lithium hub. Mali, of course, commands gold. Combined, they possess raw materials essential for energy, electronics, and military tech. And here's the catch. They're starting to say no. No to predatory contracts, no to foreign military bases, no to decades of dependency disguised as development. Instead, these countries are now exploring joint ventures, regional refining, and state-controlled resource banks. Their leaders talk openly about building African value chains, where the raw material isn't just exported, but processed, priced, and sold on African terms. This is a nightmare scenario for Western powers. The scramble for Africa's critical minerals, accelerated by the global energy transition, relies on unquestioned access. If more nations adopt Mali's approach, it's not just gold markets that shift, it's the entire economic leverage of the global north. And the signs are spreading. Guinea, rich in bauxite and iron ore, has also begun renegotiating mining deals and rejecting IMF conditions. Chad recently revoked oil agreements and seized control of its pipelines. Even Senegal, long seen as West Africa's model democracy, is now demanding a bigger stake in offshore gas fields. Each move is unique, but the message is the same. Africa is tired of exporting poverty. These leaders don't claim to be reincarnations of Mansa Musa, but they've inherited something powerful from his legacy, the refusal to be small. Yet rebellions are rarely welcomed by empires, and the old powers aren't backing off. They're deploying a new weapon: media warfare, economic pressure, and carefully engineered instability, which leads us to a looming confrontation. Can Goïta and his allies survive the storm the West is quietly unleashing in response to this gold rebellion? Only if they understand that this isn't just a rebellion, it's a revolution with enemies in disguise. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Assimi Goïta may have gold under his boots and public support on the ground, but what stands against him now is far more dangerous than foreign soldiers or corporate contracts. It's the invisible machinery of Western retaliation, subtle, deniable, and devastating. It starts with currency sabotage. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger still operate under the CFA franc, an outdated colonial relic backed by the French treasury. Although these nations are slowly moving toward monetary independence, France still wields enormous power through the control of foreign reserves, inflation rates, and transactional bottlenecks. Already, delays in transfers, sudden spikes in import costs, and blacklisted trade intermediaries have begun to choke liquidity in these rebel economies. It's not a blockade, but it feels like one. Next comes NGO weaponization. Humanitarian organizations that once focused on aid are now being quietly reprogrammed as intelligence assets. Reports from within Mali describe foreign-funded development missions, mapping resource zones, mining corridors, and demographic vulnerabilities. Their findings often land not in public health campaigns, but in think tank briefings in Brussels and Washington. Then there's the soft coup tactic, civil unrest engineering. Protests don't always begin organically. In nations targeted for destabilization, unrest is often amplified by foreign social media bots, sponsored influencers, and covert cash injections into opposition groups. Goïta's administration has already seen suspiciously timed student protests, market shortages tied to foreign supply chains, and whispers of dissatisfaction amplified by media outlets funded externally. And if that doesn't work, there's the international isolation trap. At the UN, Mali is slowly being painted as a rogue state. At the African Union, pressure is mounting for sanctions under the banner of restoring democracy. Western financial institutions, meanwhile, have begun downgrading Mali's credit rating, not because of economic data, but because of regional instability. The message is clear. You may control your gold, but we will control your future. But Goïta isn't walking into this blind. His alliance with Burkina Faso and Niger is already moving to create a new regional currency, immune from French oversight. They're working with non-Western partners, including China, Turkey, and Russia, to build trade alternatives. And in a surprising twist, they're courting African diasporas, inviting engineers, bankers, and economists home to rebuild without Western strings attached. This is not just survival, it's counteroffensive by design. Still, the stakes remain dangerously high. The last time an African leader tried to create a gold-backed currency independent of Western control, his name was Muammar Gaddafi. He ended up buried beneath NATO bombs. So the question now is no longer just about gold. It's about whether this generation of African leaders can protect their vision before it's buried like their empires were. Because if they fail, Mali's gold goes back to the vaults in Zurich. But if they win, Mansa Musa's legacy won't just be remembered, it'll be reborn. Victory won't look like waving a flag. It'll look like no longer needing one stamped by Paris or Washington. For Mali, winning this battle over gold and sovereignty is not about returning to some ancient empire. It's about constructing a new architecture of power, one that is African-owned, African-managed, and most importantly, immune to foreign sabotage. But that kind of victory is not flashy. It doesn't happen in a press conference or on a battlefield. It happens quietly, in the foundations of institutions. Right now, Mali's government is laying the groundwork for one of the most ambitious transformations in modern African history. They've begun building state-controlled mineral processing plants, so raw gold no longer needs to be flown out for refinement. That's more than economics. It's psychological warfare. Every ounce refined at home sends a message. We are capable. We are no longer dependent. And it's not just gold. Mali is developing geological and financial intelligence units, tasked with tracking mineral flows, exposing illicit exports, and shutting down underground economies that once fueled foreign-backed warlords. This means that for the first time in decades, Malians are becoming experts in valuing their land. Then there's education. Goïta's administration is quietly funding mining and metallurgy programs at national universities, ensuring the next generation of experts doesn't come from Geneva or Toronto, but from Timbuktu and Sikasso. That's not rebellion. That's statecraft. The ripple effect is already visible. Young entrepreneurs are forming gold cooperatives in local communities, using digital ledgers to track production and earnings. Local banks are beginning to extend loans to small-scale miners, backed not by international donors but by Mali's Central Reserve, funded through mineral royalties. Goïta clawed back from multinationals. And perhaps most significantly, Mali is beginning to shift its gold reserve policy. Instead of storing wealth in dollars or euros, currencies that can be frozen or devalued, there's talk of creating a gold-backed sovereign fund to stabilize the Malian economy. If successful, this fund could be the cornerstone of a new West African financial system, untethered from the CFA franc and its colonial chains. But make no mistake, building a new system is slower than burning the old one down. It requires not just courage, but time, patience, and relentless vigilance. The greatest danger now is not invasion. It's infiltration, corruption, sabotage, co-optation by elites who secretly serve foreign interests while posing as nationalists. Goïta's true test will be whether he can resist not just enemies abroad, but traitors within. Yet if Mali succeeds, even partially, it offers something the continent hasn't had in over a century: a living blueprint for how to convert resistance into reconstruction. And if that happens, Mali won't just have protected Mansa Musa's gold, it will have turned that legacy into a launch pad for a new Africa. But there's still one more question left to ask. What does this mean for the world that once ruled Africa's wealth? It means the rules are being rewritten, and the old gatekeepers are panicking. For centuries, the global economic order thrived on predictable subordination. Africa's role was clear: extract, export, and stay dependent. The industrialized world built wealth on the backs of African mines, oil fields, and farms. Mali's new rebellion and its alliance with Sahel neighbors is not just a disruption, it's a direct challenge to the ideological core of that system. If Mali succeeds in controlling and monetizing its gold supply chain, it breaks one of the longest-standing assumptions in Western financial architecture, that raw materials flow out of Africa and profits flow in the opposite direction. It exposes a deeply uncomfortable reality, that the so-called developed world is still dangerously reliant on a continent it pretends to pity. This shift terrifies Western institutions because it signals the possible collapse of leverage mechanisms they've wielded for decades: debt diplomacy, trade imbalance, military presence, and currency control. If Mali proves that a resource-rich African nation can reject Western aid and still grow, others will follow. And the result could be a chain reaction of economic defiance. Even more threatening is the narrative shift. Western governments have long framed Africa's poverty as the result of bad governance, corruption, or tribal conflict. But what happens when a disciplined, reform-driven African administration succeeds outside Western control? That destroys the excuse. It rewrites the story. It shows that poverty wasn't inevitable, it was engineered. And if that myth collapses, the moral authority of the West goes with it. Already signs of panic are emerging. Financial institutions like the World Bank are quietly updating their risk assessments for West Africa, warning of geopolitical uncertainty in regions showing resource nationalism. Think tanks in Europe and America are publishing urgent papers on strategic engagement in the Sahel, coded language for regaining influence. But perhaps the most revealing reaction has come from corporate lobbies, particularly in mining and energy. Behind closed doors, they're pushing for trade penalties, sanctions, and investment pullouts. Not because Mali is unstable, but because it's stabilizing in the wrong direction: inward, independent, and uncolonized. Yet the West faces a dilemma. Open retaliation risks global scrutiny. Covert sabotage, while plausible, is harder now with Mali turning to non-Western alliances. China, Russia, Turkey, and the Gulf states are already engaging with Mali, not as saviors, but as alternatives. This puts the West in a position it hasn't occupied in centuries in Africa: irrelevance. And for a system that built its power on managing African chaos, an Africa that manages itself isn't just inconvenient, it's revolutionary. So, if Africa stops needing the West, what happens to the West? Can they again become relevant? Let us know in the comments section. Is it possible to suppress Africa again? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.